Okay, hello and welcome everyone to our webinar number 33 for the Reclaim Network Plus. We are thrilled to have you with us today in this the second webinar of this 2025. I'm Karina Corada, and I will present today this webinar. So I will start with a brief introduction about Reclaim Network Plus. This webinar series is running by the University of Surrey in collaboration with the University of Bath and UKCEH. Thank you. This is the list of collaborators that, well, sadly today, most of them are in different meetings promoting, of course, the learning of this network. Next, please. So yeah, this Reclaim Network Plus webinar series consists of monthly online session with expert guests, a speaker from industry and academia, organization, wide range, presenting on topic related to green and blue infrastructure. It's running the first Wednesday of the month, and this year, this webinar will run until August. So if you are missing some of our webinar, not worry at all. All the webinars are recorded. So please go to YouTube channel or any link and you can see the previous 32 webinars. And next. So the network has more than 650 members in the last 2 years. They are coming from different backgrounds and interest area, from public health and well-being experts on blue and green infrastructure, as you can see in the graphs. Reclaim Network Plus has different activities as well. It has funded 9 urban green spaces and people project, workshop, conference, funding, visiting, researching, and in progress is the GBGI database about the benefit of this infrastructure in urban environment. So if you want to know more about this, please the website and follow all our social network to be updated about our news and new activities that Reclaim is doing. And next. Yes, so well, additional last week, we had the opportunity to attend the third Reclaim conference, which hosted more than 100 participants, incredible 24 speakers, and included 15 poster presentation. And also the conference showcased an incredible live artist who documented everything and the entire experience. Incredible. It has also provided a great space for networking, connecting with research, organization, and stakeholders. But, well, today we have 2 brilliant speakers. I will present the first. Is Dr. Jannis Wenk, assistant professor, a senior lecturer in water science and engineering at the Department of Chemical Engineering in the University of Bath. He research focused on water treatment process, engineering for drinking water, and wastewater treatment, particularly oxidative water treatment via ozonation and nature-oriented water treatment such as constructed wetland. Very interesting topic. So before we start with that, I just housekeeping thing. Each speaker has 20 minutes, and I encourage you all to ask questions through our session using the QI function, and my colleague Sheila will trying to address as many as possible at the end of the 2 presentations. And if you want, you can include your affiliation and, of course, your name to know each other. Okay, so please, Dr. Jannis, the floor is yours, and we will happy to know more about your project.
Great. Karina, thank you so much. Can everyone hear me and see my presentation?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure to be here and to provide the seminar series. You may realize I have changed the title of my talk slightly because I was initially preparing for a 1-hour talk, and then I realized it's only 20 minutes. So I reduced the content of my presentation a little bit, but we will also we will basically cover all the topics. So today I'm going to talk about constructed wetlands. We work with them with a few water utilities across the UK. That specific one today is the Cromhall constructed wetland with our collaborator Wessex Water. And we look specifically here at seasonal microbial community changes, but also look at pharmaceutical and antimicrobial resistance dynamics. The introduction on constructed wetland, if we look in the wider interest of reclaim as well, constructed wetlands, they are considered also as nature-based solutions. They have been used for many years already in sustainable wastewater treatment, either as decentralized solution, for example, for sewage treatments, but also like on farms. And recently, they had a revival in the UK, basically as a so-called polishing constructed wetlands. That is basically where we have already an existing wastewater treatment plant, but that may not perform certain cleaning aspects, or maybe we want to get specific removal of certain contaminants and nutrients, for example. So that is basically an option. And here we have an example. It's the Cromhall constructed wetland that is basically added to the Cromhall sewage treatment plant. The Cromhall sewage treatment plant was built in the 1960s. It uses an oxidation ditch, which is like a different version of an activated sludge process to clean municipal wastewater with a capacity of 2,000 population equivalent and a discharge of 0.5 to 3 megaliters per day. The constructed wetland was started in 2019 and commissioned in 2020, and we have been working as academics, basically investigating and monitoring the performance of that wetland since then. We see here how the constructed wetland looks since 2020. On the right-hand side, you also see the location. It is approximately half an hour by car north of Bristol and can be reached from Bath within an hour of drive. And our project collaborator is Wessex Water. The constructed wetland itself, there's a couple of different types of constructed wetlands around. The main distinction is like subsurface flow wetlands and free surface flow wetlands. Here we have a free surface flow wetland. So basically that means that we have horizontal water flow through the constructed wetland. We see here also the planting or the layout of the constructed wetland. We have like a cell TC1 that is basically a sedimentation cell where the effluent from the wastewater treatment plant arrives. Then we have 3 cells. They are densely vegetated wetland cells. They contain around 25 different wetland plants and floodland species native from the British Isles. They have a low depth, 0.3 to 0.4 meters, and a vegetation cover of roughly 80%. The remaining 20% is then open water areas. the second part of the wetland, we have a flow diversion that offers basically options for investigation, but is also relevant to run the wetland, because then sometimes the flow can be diverted while the other part of the wetland is under maintenance, for example. That discharge of that wetland goes into ecological valuable creek system. It's the Todworth Brook, which was historically an oligotrophic catchment, but that basically has been degraded. And now one aim is to put that back into a better ecological stage. As I said, we worked on it since 2020 on 3 different PhD projects. One PhD was looking at the biogeochemistry and hydrology. We had an analytical chemistry part specifically on organic trace contaminants, and a molecular microbiologist looking at fate of antimicrobial resistance and bacteria, as well as fecal contamination and microplastics. We did routine water quality monitoring that contained nitrogen, phosphor, but also pH and temperature, and also did biodiversity investigations as well on the wetland. As you see, it's quite a comprehensive project, so I can't talk about everything today. What I have chosen to talk about today is basically the specific objectives of understanding the seasonal impact on constructed wetland performance. As everyone knows, in the UK, we have basically, and in other parts of Europe as well, we have 4 distinct seasons. And the main determining factor is basically temperature, because constructed wetlands, the main treatment benefit that we have in most cases is the microbial degradation. Besides, also we have then also absorption processes and also plant related processes as well, but they differ strongly between summer and winter. We were basically interested in how the microbial ecology develops, what is the difference in pharmaceutical and personal care products degradation in the wetlands or removal, and also the microbial resistance evolution. The methods that we used that may not be known for everyone, so it starts going quite into detail here. So we did a sampling. On the left-hand side, we have the sampling campaigns. That was basically determined by the financial and also by our time resources that we had. So we basically did 3 larger sampling campaigns. Some data that I show will also have a 4th sampling campaign that we did then in in winter 2022 as well. We took composite samples over 3 days for water, and for sediments and plants, we used basically 3-point transects throughout the wetland. We can't in the picture here. We don't see we have transects alongside the treatment cells, but also in a perpendicular direction as well. And then we decided here also not to sample all cells, because these were basically too many samples. So we sampled basically in cell 1, in cell 4, and in most cases then in cell 6 and cell 8 towards the discharge of the constructed wetland as well. We used state-of-the-art microbial analysis methods, 16S meta barcoding, quantitative gene analysis, qPCR. AMR genes, there's around 20-30 different AMR genes that might be interesting for water and wastewater. We looked at the 4 most important ones, the most generic ones. Here we have a sulfonamide, an integrase gene, which shows basically general antimicrobial resistance as well. And as a comparison, here in that study, we did not use the microbial concentration directly, but we work with fecal markers, which basically can then determine fecal contamination as well. That is a reasonable marker that we use then for comparison. We use a human comparison, that is HF1H3, and a bird one, because birds like also to live in the constructed wetland. And then we basically also compare that to the bird fecal biomarker as well. The chemical analysis we use here is basically high resolution mass spectrometry, MS-MS. We use a method that can basically simultaneously determine 132 different chemical contaminants. In case you're interested in the specifics of the methods, they have been published, and you see them here on the left-hand side in the references. You can also reach out to me if you want to know more about the methods that we used. I will not talk too much about it today. So spending half the presentation already for the introduction. So now we're coming to some of the data here. We see the winter and summer conditions. So you see in the winter, due to wetland maintenance, we basically have short vegetation. The typical constructed wetland color in the UK in the winter is brown. And we see also the nice open water areas here in the wetland. Winter, relatively high flow rates and a water temperature of 1 to 10 degrees Celsius in the wetland. Summer, more fluctuating flow rates. Flow rates can be as low as 1 liter per second in the wetland in drought periods, but can be also high flow conditions in rainy periods as well, and a higher temperature. Now, looking at the data, we have on the left-hand side our planktonic community. Not everyone might be used to the kind of presentation that we have here. That is called a principal coordinate analysis, which basically shows on one graph a lot of data that is basically the relationships between the microbial, the overall microbe community, so thousands of different bacterial strains that we have. And the main takeaway from that graph here is that we basically can see very different summer and winter community in our constructed wetlands. So in the summer, we see here the green and the reddish area, very distinctive communities in the summer that basically develop in the constructed wetland. So they are intrinsic to the constructed wetland. In winter, the wastewater treatment plant has basically warmer temperatures, and wetland microorganisms don't grow that fast. So basically here we see a strong influence in the winter of the incoming wastewater treatment plant microbial community. So we see clearly in the influence of the wetland, like changing conditions between summer and winter. On the right-hand side now, a phylum level comparison in the wetland for different types of bacteria. And here the graph is complex. What I think is interesting, especially like summer conditions, that we see here a relatively strong shift. So for someone who is not used to microbial phylum analysis, there is basically these shifts are actually quite dramatic that we see here especially from the inflow to cell 4, but then also further downwards towards the effluent of the wetland. So we see clearly distinctive community, while then in the winter, these communities are actually more similar. So that is one thing. So we see clear seasonal patterns in the constructed wetland. We have also looked at the sediments in the constructed wetland. And here, what is interesting is that the wetland was commissioned in 2020. So we have basically new sediments. They have not seen wastewater, municipal wastewater, or wastewater effluent before. And they develop slower than basically our planktonic, the water-based community. So we see basically similarities here in the constructed wetland on across all years, also summer and winter conditions, so not much difference, except summer 21 here. We are not sure yet if it's an outlier or whether we see a strong development. But what you see on the right-hand side is basically that we do not observe these strong seasonal shifts. But if you look closely, we basically see like a more long-term trends from 2020 up towards like summer 21, so over 1.5 years. So very slowly, the constructed wetland sediments also along the effluent actually develop in a more or develop basically further from their initial composition. Right now, we are further investigating these data. So we are looking here whether it has to do with changing oxygen conditions in the sediments, or whether we see basically also a development based on the different nutrients that might be actually available and that settle down in the sediments of of our wetland. I move now further to the seasonal AMR gene dynamics here. Also, for those people who are not used to these slides, microbiologist, wastewater treatment, pathogen removal, we talk here about log removal. So there's basically like it's a logarithmic removal here. So each unit means 90% removal. So what we observe here is for our 4 different microbial resistance genes, we see basically a summer removal of 2 to 3 orders of magnitude. That means 99 or 99.9% of removal of antimicrobial resistance genes. Less removal here in the winter, 1 to 2 orders of magnitude. And with most genes, a similar pattern. And these removal rates, they are in fact also a rate constructed wetland as well. So that's quite good news that basically the AMR gene removal was alongside also pathogen removal. And here we have even one gene where we have more than 4 orders of magnitude removal here in part D of the graph as well. The presentation of the same data, here the relative abundance, better removal in the summer, less good removal in the planktonic phase in the winter. That also, that's on the left-hand side, that also relates to general findings on the performance of constructed wetland. In the sediments, here we see almost no AMR genes in where the wetland was commissioned. That is also reasonable because that wetland has not seen wastewater before. And then we have here slowly the accumulation of AMR genes in the constructed wetland. Briefly, because I think I'm reaching my 20 minutes here, we see the pharmaceuticals and personal care products. Generally, we see a 43 to or like a 50% removal rate. That is comparable with other wetlands as well. We have here not resolved for functional groups, but more in pharmaceutical classes. You see here a big part is basically metabolites. These are either human or antimicrobial metabolites from pharmaceuticals or personal care products from the wastewater treatment plant already, but also we see still some parent compounds. 50% is not bad. What some constructed wetlands can do up to 75%. We see here also, almost running out of time, but different contaminants. The wetland is very good in caffeine removal, here in opioid codeine as well. But we see also here in the bottom part, specifically carbamazepine. That is a contaminant that is not so well removed in wastewater generally, and we see here long-term trends and also a slow accumulation in the, especially we have seen them in the constructed wetland sediments. We have 130 different compounds here, so these data they're still not published. We will publish them this year, so there will be good publications and a very comprehensive study. Coming to the conclusions on the microbial dynamics, we have basically significant winter and summer shifts. The summer has basically, we have a distinct community of organisms in the constructed wetland. In winter, the wastewater treatment plant affects the microbial community in the wetlands, while in the sediments, we have a long-term evolution. Contaminant removal, we have antimicrobial resistance, seasonal variability, generally 1 to 3 log, sometimes gene-specific, pharmaceutical personal care product removal, overall 50% removal. Some compounds very efficiently removed, more than 70%, others not so much. Few remarks here on the environmental impact. So we have reduced reduced ecotoxicological risk for specifically for the summer influent, while in the winter the wetland doesn't treat so well, but also we see a good or better ecological improvement in downstream ecosystems. Our full publications here, that is unpublished data, they are still pending, so we will go deeper into the analysis. Acknowledgements, we had a couple, these are the 3 PhD students working on the project. Also, we had a lot of local collaborators, Cardiff, University of Bristol, and Wessex Water as well. Here's 3 publications. For those who were interested in microplastics, I haven't spoken about that. That publication came out in 2023 on the Cromhall wetland. It's so you can look it up. It's all available online. And also we have 2 publications already on the microbial community composition. So if you're interested in a more comprehensive read, go to these publications. With that, I will stop sharing my screen. Apologies, I'm a little bit over time.
No, it's okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Jannis, for this very interesting presentation. I don't know too much, so I learned quite a lot. So thank you. And I just a reminder that if you have any question, please just leave your question in the QI function or in the chat. So our next presenter is Andrew Palmer. Andrew is a doctoral researcher at the University of Liverpool. He worked in the Department of Geography and Planning, conducting case partnership research with Natural England. His research examines how UK ethnicity minority communities perceive and engage with natural spaces, with particular focus on understanding what constitutes quality in green space experience. So welcome, Andrew, and please just give your presentation.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Karina. Yeah, it's really great to be here today and being at the phase of my PhD where I'm getting to share some of my findings. And yeah, today I'm going to be talking about these kind of different experiences of people feeling, included or excluded from green spaces. And this is a paper that's going to be coming out in the next couple of weeks in Environment and Planning E, Nature and Space. And when we talk about green space, we're talking about, all different publicly accessible areas of green space on the coastline. This is in towns and in the countryside as well. So yeah, today I'm just going to give a bit of a background to the project and the specific paper, briefly go over the methodology, and then spend some time on the findings. I am kind of going to be relying on some quotes because today I really just want to give a flavour of this paper rather than just talking about it, rather give a kind of insight into what the participants said in this paper, and then we'll just be concluding. So the project background was an ESRC studentship with Natural England, which started in October 2021. Running out of time now, so I need to get writing on the thesis because I've only got a couple months left. And the original focus was on the different groups that had been identified in Natural England surveys as visiting green spaces a bit less or being less engaged. So, quite a broad range of groups, people from lower income backgrounds, ethnic minority backgrounds, even gender, disability, things like this. And the original focus was also on about these kind of motivations to visit green spaces and these kind of perceptions of quality. So, why do people want to go? What are they looking for in these green spaces? What are the positive and negatives, and what these kind of individualized kind of conceptualizations of what quality is for everyone. But as I did, a bit more reading on the topic, it became it felt like a little bit insensitive to maybe, comparing and contrasting these like very, very diverse social groups. So it narrowed in on UK ethnic minority groups and adopted a qualitative approach. And this gave us a bit more, to give a bit more sensitivity to the research, a deeper exploration of these kind of, these various intersecting factors that might affect access. And yeah, as I said, this paper today is about these kind of perceptions of inclusion and exclusion. And there's lots of different reasons why people might feel excluded. And these are just a few snippets just to kind of give a feel for this. But, there's these kind of structural reasons which might disproportionately affect UK ethnic minority groups, maybe living further away from green spaces in urban centres, less access in certain areas with poorer quality green spaces. But then we have these kind of issues of maybe racism, discrimination, the experiential barriers to access that might make people feel unwelcome. And then we also have this kind of narrative that maybe surrounds places like the countryside as a kind of codified kind of white space, which people of colour, for example, aren't feeling very welcome to visit. But some people say that this narrative in itself is kind of unhelpful because it just goes to reinforce these barriers and this narrative. People just perceive this place as somewhere they're not supposed to visit, perhaps. And in this paper we've written, we kind of see all these different reasons that might people feel excluded as kind of working together. Whether you're physically or emotionally excluded from a green space, these kind of work together. So we use this term perceived exclusion, which encompasses both subjective perceptions and tangible experience of exclusionary practices, discriminatory processes, and feelings of otherness and discomfort. So we're not inferring that it's imagined. We're just trying to highlight the variation in these experiences, as sometimes it can be perceived or a bit of unsureness about what's happening. So with the methodology, the first thing was to try and get participants, and we used various different recruitment modes for this. I've put a few here, and this kind of represents my growing desperation, I'd say, to get participants. So we started off with kind of some social media, reaching out to individuals on social media, community groups, community centres, things like this. And we asked people to refer, friends and colleagues, for example. And then we finally did a couple of days door knocking in a couple of areas of Bristol, and this was this is trying to expand the sample, but also to try and get past this kind of self-selecting bias where, ultimately people who want to take part in this kind of research are probably going to be the ones who are a bit more interested in visiting green space, really. And for the data collection, we did mainly interviews, and we also gave people the option of completing a diary where they could take pictures, send voice notes and little diary entries and things like this. And then we use the thematic analysis and all these transcripts to give our kind of findings. So from these transcripts, we identified 3 very broad umbrella themes, and this forms the basis of our publication strategy. And I thought it's worth just situating these findings here. So we have a paper that we're talking about today, which is about exclusion, but we also have some findings thinking about the role of ethnicity and culture in shaping green space practices, because obviously it's really important in thinking about quality. And then we have these kind of really strong motivations for people seeking psychological restoration. And this is a paper that will be coming out eventually, which we're going to be using a different approach, which is a composite narratives approach, which I'm quite excited about, which is kind of weaving the participants' words together to make a coherent story. But for this paper, the findings in this paper map onto these kind of 3 empirical categories, I'd say. And the first one is positive experiences. I think it's really important to highlight these experiences because, as we talked about those narratives earlier, if we only ever talk about the exclusion, we're reinforcing those narratives, and there's variations in that work which we'll talk about. We also have the kind of more negative experiences where people felt excluded, and there was variations within that. So we have kind of people talking about kind of tacit exclusion, maybe feeling excluded in more rural areas. And we also highlight this kind of idea of accentuated exclusion, where maybe certain groups, and in this case, we're going to be talking about Muslim participants who might be more likely to experience discrimination, perhaps. And the third dimension of this was this empowerment and agency, which was a bit about people asserting rights and kind of challenging this narrative about green space access. So with the positive experiences, lots of people really just said how much they loved visiting green spaces, and they didn't have any problems, and they felt excluded. Probably about half of participants said it wasn't really an issue for them, and the quote highlights that there. And this was mainly operating, I'd say, in nearby urban areas, and people kind of referenced, why would I feel out of place? I'm around my own people in these kind of more diverse urban areas. It wouldn't really affect me there, and places they were more familiar with. But then in this, people also did draw attention to the kind of contextual variation, saying, well, yeah, I feel really comfortable in this place, but if I go somewhere less familiar or maybe into a rural area, I feel a bit more out of place or a bit unsure. And there's these kind of concerns about, who's going to be asking me questions and things like that. And another important aspect in this positive experience was the kind of childhood experiences. So many participants talked about if they'd grown up being exposed a lot to nature as a child or growing up in a rural area, they just never really had any of these issues or maybe less uncertainty. And they kind of linked that to this kind of having more knowledge in maybe rural areas and this kind of confidence that was instilled from that early exposure. With the perceived exclusion, I'm not going to go through every finding. I'm just going to highlight some of the key things, I think. But with the perceived exclusion, I'd say the most common way that people felt they felt excluded was this kind of idea of tacit exclusion. And this is kind of this uncertainty and discomfort in certain areas. And this often operated with people maybe perceiving to be having unwelcoming looks, unfriendly looks, or people asking them maybe intrusive questions such as, where are you from? These kind of things, which people perceived as microaggressions, which made people feel a little bit uncertain, a little bit unwelcome. And this kind of, highlights this kind of manifestations of this kind of racialization in these spaces. So this kind of narrative that we talked about earlier is a kind of backdrop to like operates where, even if something's not directly happening, people can still feel a little bit uncertain. And I think this quote, it's a very long quote, I apologize for that, but I really want to share it because this really cuts through a strong element of this theme. And this really highlights this kind of feeling, this inner dialogue, uncertainty, concern, and these kind of the emotional kind of consequences of these experiences as well. And as I said, I really want to draw attention to the experiences of Muslim women in this case. It was where it was a small subsection in our sample, but they were the only participants who really talked about very direct and notable experience of discrimination or even racism. And often people talked about these kind of visible markers that maybe made them think that they might stand out more or be more likely. So we're talking about skin color and religious clothing. People talking about wearing the headscarf came up quite frequently. And this led people to, change their practice. We saw real evidence of saying, well, yeah, I might go to this urban park, but I wouldn't go to this one because there's unfriendly people there and things like this. So there's obviously there was a context operating with that as well. But also this kind of contrasted with those kind of experiences that I mentioned in the urban spaces where people talk about the positive experiences, where these experiences really contrasted against that because they didn't feel welcome in those areas. And this is just, I think, really important just to draw attention to these kind of identity intersections and how certain people might feel more excluded than others or more likely to experience these kind of negative encounters. And the third dimension of this kind of research was empowerment and agency. And this is really important to bring out as well because when I was having these conversations with the participants, many participants rejected the narrative in generally saying, well, I don't feel like a minority. I wouldn't let that happen to me. That's not something that would ever happen to me. And especially thinking about in urban areas, but more generally as well, feeling like a minority in the UK, many people didn't feel like that. But some people did recognize that they'd kind of changed, their experiences had changed over time. So some people mentioned how, I used to feel that, but now I've grown up, I've grown a bit older. I don't care. I wouldn't even notice it if someone was trying to exclude me, all those kind of things. And there was also examples of people really saying about how communities are asserting their right to access. And this was quite prominent with people talking about a kind of movement since COVID, where this kind of guerrilla gardening movement had taken up in Bristol, where people were kind of enhancing disused areas in urban spaces and planting vegetables, fruit and vegetables, greening areas, and just making places for the community visits. So there's a real kind of symbolic example of this kind of asserting these rights in these kind of challenging times. So just to conclude, I've just tried to give a flavour of this research really. When the paper comes out, you can dig into a bit more of the kind of theoretical side of the paper, but hopefully I've tried to convey this kind of the real diversity in these experiences. So we have the positive and the negative, and these attitudes of empowerment and agency. But also, like, see, the common experience were most often the kind of elusive and intangible feelings, which obviously operate on this kind of maybe the systemic inequalities. And we also highlight the importance of the childhood experiences in engendering confidence. Maybe this is a way for somebody to, these programs that have been shown to be successful at getting children out and families into nature might erode some of these kind of issues with feeling uncertainty. And this is like linked to representation, all these kind of things. But also good to mention that certain groups might be more likely to encounter negative experiences. We drew the case of Muslim women, but there's probably plenty of examples of this, as everyone has different intersections of their kind of identity and experiences. Just to acknowledge everyone who took part in the research and the colleagues at Natural England and my co-authors and supervisors, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Very interesting presentation. So now we have a couple of minutes for questions. So Sheila, over to you.
Thank you very much, Karina. So I'm Shelagh Malham. I'm from the University of Bangor University, and I'm one of the co-Is on the Reclaim project. We have a couple of questions. First two for Jannis, I think will go, and then I've got a couple for Andrew as well. So, Jannis, I think the first question that I got was, considering the UK's variable climate, how do constructive wetlands handle extreme weather events, such as heavy rainfall or drought, in comparison to traditional wastewater treatment plants?
Yeah, I think that is a very good question. We are currently working on a follow-up project on the Cromwell wetland, where we look basically at 4 different wetlands also across the UK. Generally, constructed wetlands are actually quite good for in case of droughts. They usually do not lose so much their treatment potential. So they still stay like other normal wetlands. They still stay relatively wet, so they retain their capacity there as well, and then they can be used just normally. There's even wetlands. They're so-called they're called tidal wetlands. They are basically they work on fluctuating water volume, because that basically increases the availability of oxygen, and then sometimes also increases like the treatment processes. For flooding events right now, the wetlands, they have an overflow. You could also see that in our wetlands. So then there would be like direct discharge into the water body as well, if there is no other storage option. But then there's also, like, I think we're working on one wetland as well that is actually also used for specifically for flood retention as well. So they serve like a dual purpose. But where I'm not sure then how it affects, actually, I think then it actually lowers the treatment performance for, especially for pathogens and nutrient removal.
Thanks very much, Jannis. I think that was fairly comprehensive. I think there's another question for you.
Yeah.
What was the biggest surprise, most unexpected result from this study?
That goes basically to our microplastics research, because when we started the research, the general hypothesis was that basically antimicrobial resistance, like that microplastics perhaps has a big issue on antimicrobial resistance. But we did not, in fact, see the specific enrichment of AMR genes on plastics. But what we've seen is basically that depending on the type of plastics, specific microbial communities may like to settle down on them. And then these specific communities, they have actually their own specific resistance genes. So that was, I think, that was the biggest surprise, and that is also what in our paper that we published on that actually that we mentioned there.
Okay, thank you. I mean, there's one of the ones that I was also interested in. Several questions I wrote down here, but I probably haven't got time to go through all of them.
No. Yeah.
There was one particular one. Did you sample? I mean, obviously you need. I don't know whether you needed to manage your sedimentation cell. I suspect you did, because otherwise that would start building up quite considerably. But the one I was more interested in is, did you take samples of the vegetation to find out whether any of the antimicrobial resistance and other potential contaminants entered the vegetation during the summer and then maybe got put back in during the winter?
Yes. We have a large database on that. That is Emma's PhD thesis. It is very comprehensive. She has just submitted her thesis, and we will submit the paper probably in the next 3 to 4 months as well. So we looked specifically at plant roots, stem, and leaves, and we compared all 132 trace contaminants as well, so we know how they behave. In most cases, they behave as expected, so it is related to the KOW value of the chemicals. And since we're here talking about mostly highly polar chemicals, the concentration into the plants is actually not as high. But in some cases, we see specific, like for some compounds, they do not follow the rule. Then they have specific uptake mechanisms into the plant. So there's like some metabolic reason for that as well. And then in some cases, we see actually enrichment in the leaves, while in most cases, we see the higher concentration in the roots as well. We also relate that data to antimicrobial resistance data in the sediments as well and in the plant roots. But I think that I can't talk about that. That is far from publishing right now.
Thank you very much. So it's really as expected, I think, overall.
Yes, most cases.
Thank you very much, Jannis. Andrew, I've got a couple of questions for you. Is there any particular type of green space that you found was more, or did you do anything separating out the different types of green space? And if there was that divided through the route of different identities?
So when you say identities,
different types of people, or different races, or are there any differences within the particular types of green space?
Well, we did differentiate in the sense that we tried to get the variation in the questions. So obviously we started off in our questions of asking people about their kind of practices. Because obviously there's other papers related to this, so it's quite a broad one. Yep. So we asked people where they visited, and most people were probably talking about their general practices in urban green spaces, which probably fulfilled these kind of immediate psychological benefits, I'd say, which are very important. But we obviously asked people, did they go into rural areas or outside the city? So that gave us that area. So we did see these kind of variations, and there was a huge variation with obviously we didn't categorize kind of class, but there's probably some people who probably were more likely to be going on long country walks and things like this, or visiting heritage sites like National Trust and things like that, where some people would say that was too expensive. So there was a huge, and also some people, I talked to, I'd say about going to the countryside, and the conceptualization of that would be completely different. So you'd get people, maybe just talking about another town nearby, for example, because obviously there was a real variation of people we spoke to. We spoke to some people from a Somali community group, and obviously their experiences and background are very different to the people who may be second, third generation or whatever in those. So it was pretty complicated in that respect, but I'd say that most people were really positive overall towards green spaces, and there was definitely a want to go to this kind of outside the city, into nature, but on the kind of immediate needs and fulfilling those kind of psychological aspects, I was definitely the urban green spaces, which were mainly met with positive attitudes, I'd say.
Yeah, no, I can see that. I mean, I think overall the other aspect I was sort of trying to get at with that question was, in some cases you can go to a green park, but where there's some trees in that green park that's a little bit darker, some people don't necessarily want to go there. They get worried about going into that because of that. So I was wondering if there was any separation on any of the different grounds, either through gender or through race or through something else.
I would say there was a slight issue in initially we wanted to get quite granular thing, because obviously when we're talking about quality, a lot of the assessments of quality, are very much objects, attributes in that. But when you actually talk about, I'd say most people talk about the social aspects when they talk about it. If you try and point them to the positive negatives, it would be very vague about what people would say. But like what you're saying, I would say there was gendered elements to it. For example, there was definitely women who'd saying about going to remote areas, just covered in one paper, going into remote areas were more worried. Well, who am I going to meet down there?
Yeah.
What's going to happen? And for example, in the case of one of the Muslim women I spoke to, someone who'd experienced just discrimination and antisocial behavior in some urban parks, she's got this picture from her diary of this like quite lush hedgerow and like a pathway, and it looks quite inviting to me, but she's saying how I don't want to go down that tunnel because I don't know who I'm going to meet to. So it's these kind of things that we might not necessarily think about. And being vulnerable with having children with them, all these kind of things are really important. And I think that is probably the strength of the research that's coming out. This is the variation, but obviously with the variation, there's less key bullet points I can just send home. It's it is acknowledging all this diversity within it, I'd say.
Okay, I did have one other question for you. Some of your research, you indicated that actually a lot of it was coming through, or indicating that it was coming from childhood experiences. Are you hoping that some of the work that you're doing will possibly in years to come be reflected? I think it already is reflected to a certain extent in classrooms and teaching and so on, but actually would you hope that some of the results of your research would now be included more to give children more of a green space experience, if you
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the one thing. I mean, it really relates to our theoretical framework. It hasn't gone into that because it probably confused me. So, but we're using this Bourdieu's it's sociology. So, cultural capital is what we're talking about in that respect. So, we're talking about these knowledge and skills that you might accrue, which makes you be able to kind of be successful in the field. And in this field, we're talking about accessing nature. So I think there's lots of research which highlights this kind of importance of these knowledge and skills. So I think in our conclusions, we do talk about, these kind of early education programs, all these kind of hands-on things to get families out there, family visits into green spaces, all these kind of things that just kind of generate this confidence. Because I think obviously that doesn't change the systemic discrimination, all those kind of things. But when I look at the key findings of people feeling a little bit uncertain and this unsureness about, is that person looking at me? Do they not want me to be here? The people who had the confidence didn't worry about that. So I know that's a simplification, but I think it's instilling that confidence and getting people to feel confident and increasing that representation, I think is pretty important. Yeah.
Thank you very much, both. Can I just check, Charlotte, that I've covered all questions in the chat and in the Q&A?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll hand back to Karina now.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, we have come to the end of our session. Thank you so much to our brilliant speakers and the discussion at the end, and also to everyone who joined us today. But before we sign off, don't forget to register in our next webinar. It's coming next month, and we have incredible speaker as well, Dr. Izzy Bray and Ben McCallan, who will talk about different topic, green and blue infrastructure and quality of life in Bristol, and as well green infrastructure in Guildford. So have a wonderful day. Thank you again, and we look forward to see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.